Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bible Speaks podcast. My name is Brian.
And I'm Daniel.
And today's story is, we're going to put another tag on there as a PG-13 article because of the subject matter of the story, which includes a homicide. The overarching theme is going to be judges, and that's something I really believe is worth sticking around for and tuning into. So if the subject matter of homicide disturbs you, I maybe just try to get through that and check this one out because I think it's worth it. What do you say, Daniel?
Yeah, I think it is worth it because, like you say, discussing judges and the biblical requirements for judges and how that works in the Bible is a really important thing for us to understand as believers.
Yeah, absolutely. So go ahead and introduce the story.
Almost just knocked over my mic. All right, so today's story, as Brian said, it does involve a homicide. Unfortunately, it is another shooting, where one person lost their life. An Orange County, California judge was arrested in the killing of his wife. On the evening of August 3rd, 2023, Orange County Superior Court Judge Jeffrey Ferguson and his wife Cheryl were seen having an argument at a restaurant near their home in Anaheim Hills, California. Christopher Alex, who is the Orange County Senior Deputy District Attorney, said that at the restaurant, Ferguson pointed his finger at his wife in a manner mimicking a firearm, and that the fight continued later at their home periodically for about an hour.
The guy at the restaurant noticed this person...
Witnesses at the restaurant noticed it, yeah. Yeah, Christopher Alex wasn't there. These are just witness reports.
I wonder if there was any kind of fear. Maybe they knew he was a judge. Maybe they didn't. I wonder if there was any kind of fear to not report the guy. That's something that to me would seem very suspicious.
It would, yeah, but I don't know. Like, I could also see, like, maybe this is a bad commentary on myself, like not wanting to get involved regardless, you know?
Yeah, but if they were in a fight, because that's what the article said, is they were actually in a fight, and he motions like he's going to shoot her. That's pretty...
Yeah, you have a good point. Especially like in like today's world with, unfortunately shootings occurring somewhat often.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you, man. Someone should have said something.
Someone could have.
Yeah. And then in reference to the hand gesture that he made earlier at dinner, his wife Cheryl allegedly said something to the effect of, "Why don't you point a real gun at me?" Only moments before he actually pulled a gun from his ankle holster and shot her in the chest in their living room.
How do they know she said that?
Their son was home.
Oh.
He didn't witness the shooting, but he was in the home, and I'm assuming he's the one who provided that information.
That's a horrible tragedy.
It's a very horrible tragedy, indeed. The judge and his son both called 911 after the shooting, and according to the deputy DA, when the 911 dispatcher asked the judge if he had shot his wife, he said he didn't want to discuss it at that time. Then the dispatcher asked again, and he said she needed paramedics. Just minutes later, according to Deputy DA Alex, Ferguson sent a text message to his court clerk and bailiff saying, quote, "I just lost it. I just shot my wife. I won't be in tomorrow. I'll be in custody. I'm so sorry."
So he confessed through text message.
Yeah, effectively. Apparently they both thought he was joking, but unfortunately he was not joking.
I would never take a text like that to be joking.
I don't know how I would react to a text like that. I think I would react, like you, like, "Oh my gosh, are you serious?"
Yeah, I might have responded, "Are you serious?" But I would have never assumed he was... Maybe
and just laughed it off, yeah.
That could be telling of the personality of the judge.
Ah, like he made those kinds of remarks often?
Maybe. If they thought he was joking, that to me is...
That's a possibility. I hadn't considered that.
Yeah.
When officers arrived on scene at Ferguson's home, they reported that he was displaying signs of impairment, such as slurred speech and smelling strongly of alcohol. Deputy DA Alex is also saying that their body cam footage caught him saying, quote, "Well, I guess I'm done for a while. Oh my God. My son, I'm sorry. Expletive, up. oh man, I can't believe I did this. So again, basically another type of confession, yeah. And then approximately 7 hours after the shooting occurred, a blood sample was taken from Ferguson, which showed that he still had a blood alcohol level of 0.06%. Now, just for reference, when your blood alcohol level is 0.08% or above, you are considered to be legally impaired in the United States. On average, our blood alcohol level decreases about 0.015% per hour once we stop drinking. So just some simple math, it means that his blood alcohol content was likely around 0.16 at the time of the shooting.
Double the legal limit.
Double the legal limit. He was very, very intoxicated. As another side note, he does have a concealed carry weapons permit, or a CCW permit, and according to CaliforniaCarry.org, the standard application for concealed weapons states, among other requirements, that while exercising the privileges granted to the licensee under the terms of this license, the licensee shall not, when carrying a concealed weapon, consume any alcoholic beverage, be in a place having a primary purpose of dispensing alcoholic beverages for on-site consumption, or be under the influence of any medication or drug, whether prescribed or not.
So you can't even step foot into an establishment that serves alcohol.
Nope. Not if you're carrying.
Right.
So clearly, he was in violation of the terms of this permit.
Well, and clearly he had a disregard for the law.
He did.
As a judge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is a very sad commentary, on the state of our justice system, if that is something that is common,
Right. Well, I don't know if it's common, but it was certainly allowed in his case.
Yeah. Obviously, he's in clear violation of the terms of this permit, and the prosecution, rightfully so, is pursuing that his CCW permit be revoked, and also that his right to possess any firearm or ammunition be revoked as well.
As it should be.
As it should be. Yeah, I don't take, those sorts of things lightly. It's something I'm somewhat passionate about.
Unfortunately, it's in his case, it's too late.
It is too late.
Yeah.
My personal opinion, given his son's familiarity of how different his dad acts when he's drunk, which I'll get to in a second, I have a really hard time believing that this was the first time he'd gotten drunk while carrying a firearm. Regardless of that, now the proper legal actions are being taken. But getting back to the story, his son told the police that his father is more heated when drinking and arguing with his wife. He also said that a few years prior, Cheryl Ferguson, the judge's wife, reported to him that the defendant had attempted suicide with a gun, according to Deputy D.A. Alex, and that his dad had on a different occasion discharged a firearm while alone in a bathroom at the house. The article also said that his son believed that was an accident, but again, anyone who's even remotely understands proper gun safety, they don't just go off. Like, you have to put considerable effort in for the trigger to be pulled and a bullet to be fired, so that's another act of negligence, in my opinion. Just as a bit of a tiny bit of a rabbit trail here, California gun laws are some of the most, if not the most, restrictive in the country. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I do want to talk about one gun law in particular, and those are something called red flag laws. Now, red flag laws in the state of California are put in place so that preemptive measures can be taken to prevent things like this. So basically, if you think that someone is either a danger to themselves or others and has access to firearms, there are processes, paths you can go down to report this to the authorities, to the police. And the police can obtain an emergency gun violence restraining order, or GVRO, and then they can go to the person's house and they can remove all of the guns from their home. Then that person has to go before a judge who determines if they are a danger or not. If the judge determines they're not a danger, then their firearms are returned. If the judge determines they are a danger, the restriction is extended, and then the person has to, take all the necessary steps to get help and, resolve whatever mental issues they have. I'm not sure if their guns will be permanently taken away or not. I didn't do enough research on that, but the reason I bring this up, it's a little bit beside the point of our story, but it's that his wife could have reported him and gotten a GVRO after he tried to kill himself with a gun.
As you're sitting here reading this, I have to wonder how much effect her complaint would have really had. She's married to a judge. It goes before a judge. He's got friends who are in the system.
Yeah.
I don't, I'm not going to assume to know anything about the situation because I don't.
Yeah.
But it just makes me wonder, would anything have really happened if she did complain, seeing as that he was a judge?
If the system works and has, people of integrity in it, I would say yes, but I don't know if that's the case.
Yeah, I don't either, and it just seems that possibly if his district attorney thought he was joking, if nobody reported at the restaurant, I just feel like he was above the law.
It kind of seems like that, huh?
I mean, maybe it's an assumption, but it's something I'm definitely considering.
Yeah, but in any case, clearly this man, number one, he was not a responsible gun owner. And also, he was dealing with some sort of mental issue, at least at one time, if he was driven to the point of attempting suicide. And I just wanted to say that if we ever find ourselves in a situation where we know someone is a danger to themselves or to others, I feel that we have a duty to say something or do something about it. And so that's why I wanted to make this known, in case not everyone knows. This is just in California, but I know, I think at least a dozen other states have similar red flag laws with regard to firearms. So, I just wanted to make a bit of a PSA, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and kind of another aside is that, I just want to point this out. Judges live very, comfortably. They make a lot of money.
Yeah, Anaheim Hills is an extremely nice area.
Anaheim Hills is a very nice area. And yet this man still wanted to commit suicide at one point. And it just kind of showcases the reality that it doesn't matter what circumstance you're in or who you are. Depression can affect you no matter what.
Yeah, it can.
Yeah.
Yeah, so back to the story. After the officers arrived, he was taken and booked into the Anaheim jail and then later transferred to Orange County Jail on suspicion of murder and was held on a $1 million bail. He posted bond the next day. He was released on August 4th, according to the jail records. And then on August 10th, 2023, he was charged with fatally shooting his wife at their home in Anaheim Hills on August 3rd. He was charged with murder, including sentencing enhancements for the personal discharge of a firearm causing death, and also the personal use of a firearm.
I don't even understand how you can post bail. I'm sorry, I'm going back to this point because it just really struck me. How do we, in our judicial system or legislature, whatever it is, how do we allow people who are suspected of murder to post bail?
I don't think he should have been granted bail.
I don't understand how that was. And you can post $1 million. He obviously had the money. I mean, that makes no sense.
Well, I think he posted a bond, which is like 10%. So he had $100,000.
Yeah.
Right?
But he shouldn't have. He's suspected of murder. He even confessed on camera. I mean, why are we... Anyway,
yeah, no,
sorry.
I totally agree with you. I was surprised. Even, at the high number, I don't think he should have even been granted bail.
No, it makes no sense.
I think he should have been denied bail.
Yeah.
And then also, kind of going back a tiny bit as far as California gun laws are concerned, part of those are these gun enhancements for crimes, which their goal with having these on the books is to make severe punishments for people who commit crimes using firearms to sort of deter those from happening. Mm-hmm. I kind of wish California would use that logic for other sorts of crimes, but
sure.
I digress. So again, those two enhancements were the personal discharge of a firearm causing death and the personal use of a firearm. Now, just that first enhancement alone carries an additional sentence of 25 years to life. So it's safe to say that he will die in prison if he is convicted, because that 25 to life would be in addition to the sentence he may receive for the murder of his wife. So he could potentially get sentenced with 2 life sentences. And he's like 72 years old, I think.
Oh, so he's not got long.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least in jail.
At least
it's going to be a very hard. Well, I don't know where he would end up.
He'd probably end up in like a white collar type of jail.
My guess is because they, and I've heard this before. They if they find that if he were put into general holding, he probably sentenced a lot of those people.
Oh yeah, so he'd be in like some sort of protective custody type thing. Yeah, you're right.
So we talked about this judge. Obviously, this is a tragic story, and our condolences go out to the family. This is just awful. But it does bring up the concept of judges, and I wanted to take a look at what the Bible said about judges. And first off, I want to see what it says. What is a judge in Scripture, and how does the Bible define it? So I just want to start off right away. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. It says this is God giving commands to Moses. I commanded your judges at that time, hear the cases between your brothers, and judge rightly between a man and his brother or his resident alien. Do not show partiality when deciding a case. Listen to small and great alike. Do not be intimidated by anyone, for judgment belongs to God. Bring me any case too difficult for you, and I will hear it. I'm sorry, that was Moses talking to the people. And then it ends with, at that time, I commanded you about all the things you were to do. So first and foremost, judges were responsible for hearing cases between 2 parties, much like it is in the United States.
Yeah.
Judges were also commanded to judge rightly between 2 parties. And so what does it mean to judge rightly? And in the most basic of terms, it means that the judges in the Old Testament, judges in the Bible, were meant to judge in accordance with God's moral standard, or the law, right? Which was, the first few books of the Bible. It was also considered a righteous judging. Judges were not to show partiality when determining cases. That means they could not consider anything about the individuals. They could not consider their status. They could not consider
personal relationships.
Yeah, personal relationships. They couldn't consider their employment, whatever they may have worked, like a DA or something. You couldn't consider that. You had to be completely impartial. Mm-hmm. And then the judges were to give an audience to whomever came before them, regardless, again, of status. And so they had to hear all cases. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter if you were poverty. And people would just kind of say, well, do they really matter? Yeah, of course they matter. They're human beings, and they're people of... In this case, they were the people of God.
So like everyone from like the lowly beggar, all the way up to the high priest, like all of them would get an audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then judges were to have the fortitude to not be intimidated by any human being, because a righteous judgment came from God. And so what that means is that they had to adhere to the law of God, the moral law of God, which meant that their judgments, how they decided a case, could not be intimidated to go one way or the other. They had to say, this is what God's standard is, and I can't sway one way or the other, regardless of what harm may come to me, because it is not my personal judgment, it's God's judgment. And I think that's a huge differentiation between today's judges, and especially in the United States, versus the judges of the Bible. The judges of the Bible were not allowed to make up their own rules. They had to adhere to the Mosaic law, the law of God. And it was actually made it kind of easier for them, because they had a script they had to stick to.
Yeah.
If you did something, you could look it up and say, well, this is the crime, you did it. We have enough witnesses to determine that you did do it, so you're guilty, or whatever, you're innocent. And then also in this passage, Moses was considered the supreme court of the land, if you will. He was a single person. He wasn't a party of people. But any case that was too difficult for a regional judge to decide would go to Moses. And so kind of like the same thing with us having local courts and local judges, and then it would be going up to the Supreme Court. The only difference is there was no such thing as an appeals process. The only reason you went to Moses was because you couldn't figure it out on your own. Right, you didn't know what the right answer was.
Yeah, so if the lower, so to speak, the lower judges made a judgment, you couldn't be like, I don't agree. I want to hear what Moses has to say.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Their word was final.
Yes. The local judge would have to actually say, I don't know how to rule this case.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just take it to Moses. The next passage is Deuteronomy 16:18 through 20a, and I put A because I only do the first half of the verse. Appoint judges and officials for your tribes and all your towns the Lord your God is giving you. They are to judge the people with righteous judgment. Do not deny justice or show partiality to anyone. Do not accept a bribe, for it blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. Pursue justice and justice alone. So judges were appointed by region. Again, much like our regional courthouses, we have county, we have state, we have things like that. And then they are commanded to judge with a righteous judgment, again, that is based on God's law. The judges are commanded to enact justice and not show partiality based on who was being tried. These are things that are getting repeated, and so they were obviously very, very important to God and the nation. Judges were commanded to not take bribes so that their judgments would not be swayed away from the justice of God. I don't know if that's something that kind of got lost in the weeds. I feel like sometimes it's possible that judges do take bribes nowadays. I don't know that for sure. If these guys were caught doing that, they would be found guilty and condemned.
What do you know what the punishment would be for that?
To be a false witness was to be killed.
Taking a bribe as a judge would be considered false witness?
Well, yeah, because you would rule in accordance with the bribe rather than the actual...
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so you would be bearing false witness to that party or whatever.
I feel like that it kind of shows how far we've strayed from God's moral standard. Back then, taking a bribe, death penalty.
Yeah.
Because even to me, I'm like, man, that seems kind of harsh, you know?
You're right. But it was very, very important to maintain the righteousness of God, you know, with the people. Judges were commanded to pursue justice and nothing else. And that word justice, I feel like, needs to be defined. It was interesting. Dictionary.com defined justice as righteous, equitable, and morally right. And I think that's a really good definition.
That is a good definition.
Yeah. When it comes to the people of God, there's only one source of justice. There's only one source of righteousness, equality, and moral correctness, and that is God himself. So again, they always had to turn back to the law of God. Leviticus 19:15 and 16 says this: Do not act unjustly when deciding a case. Do not be partial to the poor or give preference to the rich. Judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not jeopardize your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. So this passage commands judges to not be partial to the poor when deciding a case. So this would be the opposite of accepting a bribe from somebody who can afford to offer a bribe. This is denying justice for the sake of sympathy. And that what that means is that if you feel sorry for somebody, or if you feel like they have a harder lot in life than the person who's wealthier, you don't get to judge them based on their lot in life. You still have to adhere to the law of God, regardless of their status.
So that would be like if this person was very poor and just, had a life full of hardship, and they were like, man, I don't want to add to that. That's what this is talking about? Yeah,
or even letting them off the hook for something they did and then going, well, they were desperate.
Oh, like they stole food or money or something.
Right.
I gotcha. Okay, wow.
Yeah, and before people, kind of push back on that, you have to understand that also in God's economy in the nation of Israel, nobody was supposed to be so poor that they starved to death.
Yeah,
right?
there were provisions for that.
Yeah, there were provisions and accommodations for people who didn't have or who were without. And so nobody was supposed to show sympathy or partiality for the poor when it came to God's moral law. You still were expected to maintain righteousness. This passage also condemns partiality toward the rich, just as the previous verses have done. Judges were also not to go about slandering other people. Judges needed to be seen as impartial, and therefore could not speak poorly of others, even when they were not quote unquote on duty. So you couldn't go after you were done, your daily duties for the job of judging. You couldn't go to the local, eatery and go, man, this person can't believe they did, they're this horrible people or whatever. Because what that does is it gives you a bias. And it also lets other people know that you have a bias. So by speaking poorly of someone or by having a negative outlook upon someone, this may jeopardize the judge's capability to judge impartially.
I think that goes right in line too with God's requirements for like other positions, like deacons or elders. You know, they're all supposed to be men of upright character.
Yeah,
you know?
above reproach.
Above reproach. So
Yep.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Being a judge meant that you saw everyone equally.
Mm-hmm.
You could not see anyone as different or special. Jumping to Romans 13, and I bring this up. We're still talking about the Old Testament, what are judges, but this is a good passage because we've brought it up before, but we've always used it in the sense of governors, right? Governors or presidents or kings or leaders. But it says this, let everyone submit to the governing authorities, since there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are instituted by God. So then, the one who resists the authority is opposing God's command, and those who oppose it will bring judgment on themselves. You know, once again, we've brought this up regarding other people, but we've never brought it up in regards to judges. But the truth is, so long as a judgment is not in opposition to God, the people of God are to obey it fully, whether we agree with the judgment or not.
Yeah, so like just last week, we talked about this with the, or not last week, last episode. We talked about this with the believers in China and, you know, other countries who are like going to prison because they're a Christian. In that case, you know, if it's a judge saying you're sentenced to 2 years in jail for apostasy or, you know, whatever, you take that punishment.
You do. You absolutely do. Yeah. An example of this, and we're, you know, Daniel just got done talking about gun laws. An example of this would be strict gun laws. Nothing in Scripture suggests that gun laws violate the righteous moral law of God. Therefore, the people of God need to adhere to gun laws. Like, so if you're in a state or if you're in the country and it has certain gun laws and you don't like them, too bad, right? You still have to adhere to them because those are not in direct contradiction to God's moral law.
Even if you think those laws are unconstitutional, it doesn't matter. The fact is they are law in your state until they are overturned.
That's right.
You
Yeah.
know?
Until they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah. An example of a law that may pass
Real quick, I just want to say that was something that took me years to, like, that conclusion took me years to come to.
You personally?
Because I felt so strongly about it, you know?
Yes.
But this is the truth of God. These are his laws, and we have to conform ourselves to that.
Yeah, and you know, not to bring up just this horrible topic, but you know, had people adhered to the gun laws in this state, that judge would not have been able to do what he did.
Yeah, he wouldn't have had a gun on him.
Right.
Yeah.
So, you know, we may not always agree or even see why things are in place, but it really doesn't matter when in regard to judgments that are not contradictory to God. An example of a law that may pass that would be contrary to God is, and I might get in trouble for saying this, don't really care, is any law requiring citizens to acknowledge genders beyond male and female. This is big in the news right now. It's kind of big in our society and here in the United States. This would be in direct contradiction to Genesis 5:2, which states that God created them male and female. So we have to understand as Christians that we cannot adhere to a law that is in direct contradiction to God's moral standard.
Yeah.
You know, so that's, just wanted to throw that out there as two examples.
Yeah, you brought up that verse. You want to hear like the craziest way I've heard someone try to say that this is God saying that there's more than just male and female?
That verse?
That verse.
How do you take that verse any other way?
So it says them. So they're like, yeah, he created them, male and female.
Oh my gosh.
And I'm like, no, that is not what that means. Read the verse right before it.
We also need to take literature classes to understand sentence structure.
Yeah, well, yeah. And I'm not trying to like degrade this person, but they didn't seem like the sharpest tool in the shed.
Well, that's it's.
I feel like that's just a willful ignorance. Like you're just trying to make it fit what you believe at that point. You know?
Yeah, you're twisting the sentence to mean something it was never intended to mean.
Yeah,
yeah. So they probably weren't. They probably were a pretty sharp person that in that they were thinking about how can I twist this.
Oh yeah,
to mean
maybe.
It doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ezekiel 44:24a. In a dispute, they will officiate as judges and decide the case according to my ordinances. This passage from Ezekiel simplifies the standard of law which was to be applied to the people of God. quote unquote, according to my ordinances. So this is not open to interpretation. God's moral law is the standard by which all of God's people should live. And that actually applies Old Testament and New Testament. His moral law has not changed at all.
No, it is still in place today.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the episode. So here's a, plug. But when we judge each other, and yes, Christians are supposed to judge each other, it must align with God's moral law or it has no validity within the church. And again, we'll jump on that later on, so stay tuned for that topic. I'm going to jump into Old Testament judges as well. So we want to look at, we saw how judges were to behave, what they are, how they're defined. But now let's look at some examples of, how judges actually behaved in the Old Testament. So Judges, the book of Judges, chapter 2, verses 16 and 18, the Lord raised up judges who saved them, being the people, from the power of their marauders. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for the Israelites, the Lord was with him and saved the people from the power of their enemies while the judge was still alive. So judges in the Old Testament provided a dual role, which we do not expect of judges today. The first one we do, they were to decide cases between two parties in accordance with God's moral law. We talked about that already. They also served as a protector of sorts for God's people from Israel's enemies. I do want to state here that the Old Testament judges no longer exist, and honestly were eliminated fairly early on when Israel decided they wanted a king instead of judges. If you are familiar with the Old Testament, you will know that the request for a king was a direct violation of God's economy, and the Israelites suffered greatly because of that request. So the judges ended with King Saul. That's when there was no more judges in Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 25, 1 and 2. If there is a dispute between men, they are to go to the court, and the judges will hear their case. They will clear the innocent and condemn the guilty. If the guilty party deserves to be flogged, the judge will make him lie down and be flogged in his presence with the number of lashes appropriate for his crime. A judge's word was final. Whatever they determined would rule as law. If a person was found guilty, they would be punished accordingly. If a person was found innocent, their name was cleared and nothing further could be done. There was no appellate court. You could not appeal to a higher authority. The judges were responsible also for the type and amount of punishment a person would receive for their crime. So much like our own judicial system, the judge determined the punishment for a crime. And I kind of put sort of, because although the judge would state the punishment, even the punishment had to align with what God had already determined to be just punishment in the books of the law, primarily Leviticus through Deuteronomy. So they called for punishment. They saw that the punishment was carried out, and it had to be in accordance with the punishments that were listed in God's books of the law. 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 15 through 17. Samuel judged Israel throughout his life. Every year he would go on a circuit to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and would judge Israel at all these locations. Then he would return to Ramah, because his home was there. He judged Israel there, and he built an altar to the Lord there. So I bring up this verse because Samuel was the last official judge in Israel in the Old Testament before the age of the kings. After the appointed judges, kings would judge the nation, oftentimes however they saw fit, and honestly, very poorly. To elaborate on something I mentioned earlier, the onset of the age of the kings in Israel provided very little benefit and ultimately led the nation to enslavement and bondage. The majority of the kings did not adhere to the law of God and did whatever they pleased. Israel was intended to be a theocracy, which means that it is a government run by God's moral law, which was exacted by appointed judges. That was the design for Israel. The people, however, did not think that that was the best way to live, and they suffered the consequences for their disobedience.
I got a question for you.
Yes.
How were the judges appointed? Was it God or something else?
God would actually raise them up to be the judge in the land.
What does that mean? What did that look like?
There's not a lot of explanation about how each judge was declared. You look at oftentimes the priest would lay their hands on them, or they'd be given word from God that this is going to be the judge.
Okay.
But we're not actually given exact instances where you see the calling of each individual. It just kind of says, and then so and so was judge.
Yeah. That's what I was asking. Like, I was, oh, maybe Brian knows, because I couldn't. I was like, it just moves like from judge to judge, from king to king.
I would guess that. Yeah, I would wager a guess that it was probably the priest that God spoke through.
That makes sense.
To appoint the judge, because that's even what happened with Saul. Is Samuel had to appoint Saul king, and then appoint David king. That's a whole different story. Anyway, moving on. Micah chapter 7, 2-3. Faithful people have vanished from the land. There is no one upright among the people. All of them wait to ambush, to shed blood. They hunt each other with a net. Both hands are good at accomplishing evil. The official and the judge demand a bribe. When the powerful man communicates his evil desire, they plot it together. So this verse points out the danger of corruption that even the judges were susceptible to in the Old Testament, and why there needs to be warnings and checks and balances with governing authorities. And I think, honestly, with governing authorities in any capacity, today too.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, it is very unfortunate, but also the plight of humankind to be corrupt. This is our nature. When human nature takes over, ultimately injustice and the desire for power and influence rise up.
Man, that's like even what the serpent tempted Eve with.
Yeah,
from eating from the tree. Like, don't you want to know what God knows?
Right. Don't you want to know good from evil? Don't you want to know? Don't you want to be like God?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. It's definitely in our nature.
Absolutely. This is the condition of fallen humanity, and ultimately why we need a savior and a new heaven and a new earth in eternity. We will need new creation because current creation is fallen and corrupt. Contrary to what some would love to believe, people will never be good without God. We may do good things from time to time and have the best of intentions, but I'm just going to be dead honest, world peace is not possible.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about how judges are appointed in the United States. It's not consistent, sort of, at all. It varies on a state-by-state basis. In California, according to courts.ca.gov, before June of 1998, California's trial court system consisted of both superior and municipal courts. So municipal court was like the lowest one, and then there was superior courts. They each handled different types of cases, and the superior court had authority over the municipal court. They each had their own jurisdiction as well as their number of judges fixed by the voters. But then on June 2nd, 1998, California voters approved a constitutional amendment that permitted the judges in each county to unify their superior and municipal courts into one single superior court with jurisdiction over all case types. The reason or the goal of unifying the court was to improve services to the public by consolidating court resources, offering more flexibility in case assignments, and then also saving taxpayer money.
Isn't that what led to... it was kind of... Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't that unifying kind of take power away from the counties?
Well, each... So my next point here, by February 2001, judges in all 58 counties had voted to unify their trial courts. So, I mean, it's still like the county... Basically, and I don't know if it limited their power. I don't know. It seems like it just streamlined the process.
Okay.
You know? Yeah. I'm too young to remember this.
Sure.
I was... I was... in 98, I would have been 5.
You were definitely too young. Yeah.
As far as what members make up the superior courts, and then also their qualifications, there are 3 main roles. There's superior court judges, authorized commissioners, and referees. I don't know what all 3 of those do. I didn't do the research on that. The judges, though, they do need to have been an attorney admitted to practice law in California, or have served as a judge of a court of record here in California for at least 10 years immediately preceding their election or appointment to judge. California State Legislature decides the number of judges that are in each court. The Superior Court judges serve 6-year terms here in California, and they're elected by county voters on what's known as a nonpartisan ballot during a general election. What that means is they're on the ballot, but their political party preference is not listed. It's just you have a choice of judges, and you pick which one you would like to vote for. When vacancies do arise, they are filled by the governor. So that was just California. I wanted to go a little bit deeper on that than the other states because, we live in California. This case happened in California that we're talking about today. So as far as how the rest of the country works, I'll briefly go over it here. According to a website called democracydocket.com, no state actually selects their judges, all types of judges, in exactly the same way as another state. But there are some commonalities that exist. There are basically 5 main ways that state judges are appointed. There's a partisan election, a nonpartisan election, a legislative election, a gubernatorial appointment, and last, a merit selection. I'll briefly explain those right now. A partisan election, these are just like the way we vote for any other government position. Candidates are selected by political parties before a primary, or they're selected by political parties after a partisan primary election, and then they're voted on by the voters in the general election. Then there's a nonpartisan. They're very similar to the partisan elections, but the judges are not listed. The judges are listed on the ballot without any political party affiliation. Primary elections can be held for these, but it's mostly just to whittle down the pool of candidates all the way down to 2. It's not to select nominees from each party. And then that's not to say that political parties don't endorse judicial candidates. They do. But none of that information is put on the ballot. Next is a legislative election. This type of selection is done only in a handful of states. Through this process, judges are selected by the state legislature, so that'd be like the state Senate and the state Congress. They're selected with no input from either the governor or the voters. An example of this would be in Virginia. All judges in Virginia are selected by the Virginia General Assembly. And that actually dates all the way back to the colonial period, which I thought was pretty cool. The judges are elected by a majority vote of both chambers, and then if a vacancy occurs and the General Assembly is not in session, the governor is allowed to appoint a temporary replacement until the General Assembly can gather again and vote in a new judge. Next is the gubernatorial appointment. This type of appointment is very similar to the way the President of the United States is responsible for picking judges for the federal Supreme Court. For this type of appointment, the governor nominates judges to the court, and then the nomination is confirmed by another government branch or body. Usually it's like one of the chambers of the state legislature or the governor's council, something along those lines. And then last but not least, and my personal favorite of these, is a merit selection. This method is also known as assisted appointment, or also the Missouri Plan. It's the most common method in the country, with a total of 14 states using it to select judges for their state Supreme Courts. The specifics do vary by state, but generally speaking, with this method, the governor selects judges from lists that have been given to him or her of eligible candidates by a nonpartisan commission that bases its decisions on the candidate's qualifications and experience. Once selected by the governor, these judges usually need to go through what they call a retention election shortly after they've been appointed, and then again at the end of their terms, which does give the voters some influence over the judges. I like that one because it seems like that's the most likely form of appointment to ensure that you're getting people of integrity, people who have good records, good track records as judges. I guess as long as the like the state legislature and the governor, are also people of character, right?
Right.
But I mean, if you could have, or if you could have a favorite way of appointing judges, that would be mine, the merit-based one.
I think merit should be used in a lot of instances.
Right?
Yeah. So back to the Bible, judging in the New Testament. And I kind of put a little bracket around a subcategory, who is to judge. So now I want to look at judging in the New Testament, and in particular, who is supposed to be judging. I want to start right away with Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, because it is one of the most out-of-context passages in circulation today. I hear it used all the time in just poor usage. So let me go ahead and read Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others, and you will be measured by the same measure you use. Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take this splinter out of your eye, and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? Hypocrite! First take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. So Matthew 7:1, again, one of the most taken out of context passages in circulation today. I hear it all the time, and I hear it as, especially from people who have a very, very, very cursory knowledge of the Bible, and they use it against Christians. I've heard that the most. They look at Christians and they go, "You can't judge me. Your Bible says don't judge, or you'll be judged," or I don't know, some garbage like that.
Or people will say only God can judge me.
Yeah, that's another one.
That should scare you.
That should scare you, yeah. So most times that first verse, do not judge, that you will not be judged, most people just stop there. But the reality is there's so much more to this passage. As I just read, the passage goes on to talk about how whatever standard we use to judge others will be used to judge us. Well, we need to ask the question, who is judging us? And why is that a concern? So when Jesus states these words, what he's talking about here is the eternal judge. He's talking about eternal judgment. The one judging us will be him in regards to eternity. We'll get into that a lot more later on in my last topic. The point here is that the judging Jesus is talking about is again eternal judgment, and it's a judgment of condemnation. This verse is only referring to eternal judgment. What was happening and what Jesus is condemning is that people were judging others unto condemnation. He was basically correcting people for looking at somebody else and saying, "You're not worth my time. You're not worth anything. You're going to go. You're basically condemned to hell."
And this is verse 1 you're talking about?
It's the whole passage.
Oh, okay.
It's the whole passage, but especially, verse 1 through 5. In other words, what Jesus is saying here is, don't assume you know whether or not someone is going to go to heaven or going to go to hell. You don't know that. Only God knows that. Quick disclaimer here, this does not mean that we cannot know who is currently a believer or not based upon a person's fruit. That's another matter altogether, and I will get into that soon. What we do know, or what we do not know, is the eternal condition of any other person. Only God knows that. That's the whole point of talking about hypocrisy and the beam of wood, which, by the way, is a analogy for sin, in our own eye versus the splinter in our brother's or sister's eye. Christians should never assume that anyone is eternally condemned. That's not for us to decide. We don't get to make that decision.
So that's what Jesus was saying here. Don't judge people unto eternal condemnation.
Correct.
Okay.
Absolutely. So when we say things like "don't judge" or don't judge or you'll be judged, or whatever it is that they say, they're taking it out of context. They think that it's any calling out of their behavior whatsoever. But that has nothing to do with this passage. This passage has everything to do with eternal condemnation. So again, just to summarize, this doesn't have anything to do with calling out sin. This is something that we are called to do, is to call out sin. Again, I'll make that more clear a little bit later, but this passage has everything to do with our eternal condition, which nobody has the authority to declare except Jesus himself. 1 Corinthians 5:12 through 13, and this is kind of getting into what I was talking about judging each other. Paul is saying, he says this, "For what business is it of mine to judge outsiders? Don't you judge those who are inside? God judges outsiders. Remove the evil person from among you." So this verse is equally as important as the last one because it helps us understand judgment in both the New Testament and even in the church today, how we are to judge one another. Paul is calling the church to call out other proclaiming Christians when they are living intentional and unrepentant sinful lives. The purpose of doing this is twofold. The first purpose is that we need to be holding each other accountable in order to bring people back into a good and unhindered relationship with God, because sin is causing a hindrance to the relationship that a person has with God. The purpose of this judgment is not condemnation, but actually reconciliation. We should desire to not only reconcile other people back to God, but to be reconciled to God when we go astray. So we should actually be wanting people to come and call us out on our sin.
Yeah.
The second part of this is that if the proclaiming Christian continues to be unrepentant and continues to carry on in their sinful ways, then the church is actually supposed to remove them from their midst. We're not to suffer unrepentant sinners because, as Jesus said, a little leaven leavens the whole batch of dough in Galatians 5:9. Meaning, a little sin within the body of Christ permeates and makes its way through the whole body, which is unacceptable to Christ. And so if we are not judging each other, if we are not calling each other out in our sin, then we're allowing sin to run rampant within the body of Christ, which is absolutely unacceptable to Christ himself, who is the head of the church. I started with 1 Corinthians 15. I want to circle back to verse 12. Paul also makes the case here that Christians have no business judging the world. Those who do not know Christ are not, I put here, held to the same standard as those who are known by Christ. But what I mean by that is that they don't know any better. They don't understand the standard of the morality of God.
Yeah, God hasn't revealed himself to these people. And so because he hasn't revealed himself, there was no way they could understand or know any better.
And so to call them out, to say, "Hey, you're a sinner. You're not measuring up to God's standard."
It means nothing to them.
It means nothing.
Yeah.
Why would they even care?
Yeah.
Right? That, as Paul says in the very end, that's for God to do.
Yeah.
Right? God judges those people. We don't judge those people. In regards to the lost and fallen world, the Christian is to be sharing the gospel and nothing else. I think Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 2:2 just resonate here. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I think if Christians took that approach to the world around us, we would be a lot more accepted and even appreciated. If we didn't sit there and tell people all about, "Oh, you're not living this act is you're going to go to hell because of that." Instead of saying, nobody, even me, I was condemned before Christ saved me. You're condemned because we stand that way. It's not about your particular sin. It's not about that one instance that I'm going to pick on you for, right? It's about this concept that there's nothing good about us and that nobody seeks after God. And we all need Jesus Christ as our Savior to save us from eternal condemnation. But we're not saying that they're hopeless or they're helpless and that there's no way they're going to go to heaven. Because that is God's determination. It's really of no benefit to either the believer or the non-believer to hold the non-believer to the same standards by which the believer is held. We shouldn't try to reconcile somebody's relationship to God who has no relationship with God. Right? We only try to remove the hindrance to people who have a working relationship with God. Right? So we're going to pick out each, individual sin. Hey, I noticed that you just lied to that person, deceiving them, and you were slandering so-and-so, and I really want to bring this up because I think this is hindering your relationship with God, and I want you to have a better relationship with God. I'm not going to go to somebody who's of the world, a non-believer, and say, I heard you slandering that person, and it's really hindering your current relationship with God. They don't have a relationship with God, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction, is the reason that you do call them out on their sin, you do judge them for it, is to restore their relationship with God.
Yeah.
Like you've pointed out, you can't do that with someone who doesn't have a relationship with God.
Right, there's nothing to restore.
Yeah.
Right, it's absent.
Yeah.
Right. So that is the underlying difference there. Luke 6:37. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. The reason I bring this verse up is because I really think it hits home with Matthew 7, in that the judgment of Matthew 7 is talking about condemnation. Luke uses these words interchangeably, judgment and condemnation. And then the opposite of condemnation and judgment is forgiveness. When a Christian is presented with their sin, they need to repent of that sin. It is the body of Christ's responsibility to forgive that person if they do, in fact, repent of the sin. In this situation, forgiveness is the Christian's role. Condemnation is never the Christian's role. We have to leave that to God. John 7:24, stop judging according to outward appearances, rather judge according to righteous judgment. To carry on with how we are to judge in the New Testament, the standards of the Old Testament have not changed. When we do judge, we are not to judge based upon outward appearance or status or any other outside factor. We are to judge according to God's moral law and his righteousness. So when we're dealing with fellow believers, we are not to have, partiality in regards to somebody who maybe is popular. If you're popular, but you're also gossiping, it doesn't matter. You still have to call them out because that's still a hindrance to their relationship with God, right? So we need to make sure that we're not showing partiality when it comes to somebody who we think may get a pass because of who they are. We cannot determine what we believe ought to be judged and not judged. We cannot determine what is sin to God and what is not sin. We must judge in accordance with God's righteousness and his revealed law. And so what I mean by that is, let's say that somebody is habitually sinning in a certain way, and we go, well, I get it. Your circumstance, it's understandable. I get why you're sinning, so we'll just brush that aside and carry on.
Just to give some more substance here, let's go back to a previous example. Someone's constantly stealing food because they're starving, they're hungry.
Yeah.
And that's their solution. I'll just steal it.
Right.
Right.
And then we go, well, you need food.
Yeah.
So we're going to call that not a sin.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a sin according to God's moral law.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, if there's somebody who has to steal food, the church needs to step up and provide.
That's why I brought that up.
Right, for that person, because there are, things in play that we're supposed to be doing for the church.
Yeah.
But yeah, really good example, Daniel. Thank you for that.
All right, so now I'm going to talk about the responsibility of judges in the United States. In this country, judges are entrusted with the task of upholding, interpreting, and defending the law, as well as determining the appropriate sentencing for convicted criminal defendants. According to find.uscourts.gov, judges have 5 basic tasks. Their first task is to preside over the trial and ensure that order is maintained. The second is to determine if any of the evidence that the parties want to use was obtained illegally or improperly. Their third task is to give the jury instructions about the law that applies to the case and the standards that it must use in deciding the case before they begin their deliberations. Their fourth task is, and this only applies to bench trials, it's to determine the facts of the case and to issue a ruling based on those facts. So in case you're unfamiliar, a bench trial is a trial that takes place without a jury. The judge is presented with all of the relevant evidence, then determines what the facts of the case are, and then issues a ruling based on his or her findings. And then the fifth task is to appropriately sentence convicted criminal defendants. Now, I would also add, I've already said this a couple times, that as a judge, they should be people of integrity. They should be people who are committed to leading by example and also committed to not abusing their position of power in order to bend the law in order to favor themselves or their family or their friends.
I feel like the concept of judge hasn't changed much of what a judge is supposed to be from Bible times.
Yeah, the ideal hasn't changed much, right?
Yeah, it's still the same above reproach standard.
Yeah.
And even the methodology of how to determine, whether something is right or wrong, and then to issue judgment, I think that still carries.
Yeah, I mean that bench trial, that's literally the Old Testament judges, like the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's literally what would happen. They'd be presented with the evidence, they decide the facts, they make a ruling.
Yeah. And then they determine the punishment.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, so coming back to the Bible, we're going to close out on this one with the theme or the idea of the judge who sits upon the eternal judgment seat. James chapter 4, verse 12 reads this way. There is one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy. But who are you to judge your neighbor? James drives home the concept of judging unto condemnation and its error. To segue from my last topic to this one, James makes it clear that judging unto condemnation is a right that only God has, who is, as he puts it, the one lawgiver and judge. So, just kind of summarize, we don't have a right to judge unto condemnation. Only God does. We do have a right to judge for the reconciliation of fellow believers to God, but not to condemnation. Psalm chapter 94, verses 1 and 2. Rise up, judge of the earth, repay the proud what they deserve. Lord, how long will the wicked celebrate? The concept of God as judge resonates throughout Scripture. Here, the psalmist is pleading to God to rise up and judge the earth. The perspective of the psalmist is right and good in that he does not assume that it is his responsibility to judge the world. He defers to God, whom he calls the judge of the earth. The title should help us understand who God is in relation to his creation. He is the only lawgiver. He is the only righteous judge. He is the only one who is capable of issuing true and everlasting justice. He also is the only one who carries the qualification of deciding a just punishment. And the last thing that the psalmist states here is that judgment is also in God's timing. While we may not understand why evil and wickedness have run rampant in the world for so long, we must also defer to God for his timing and his purpose to be fulfilled. We must trust that in his perfect time, he will bring justice for good or for bad upon the earth.
Yeah, it's so important just to rest in God's sovereignty. It's not for us to worry about.
It's so frustrating if we don't.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. John chapter 12, 47 and 48. If anyone hears my words and doesn't keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and doesn't receive my sayings has this as his judge. The word I have spoken will judge him on the last day. This is Jesus speaking, and he's speaking during his earthly ministry. I have heard some people say that Jesus doesn't judge, but only saves, that he says here he's not going to judge, he didn't come to judge. But, while it is true that the reason Jesus came to earth was to seek out and save the lost, this does not nullify his current role as eternal judge. Notice that he also states in the same passage that the word he has spoken will judge people. John 1 tells us that in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word then became flesh and dwelt among us. The words Jesus speaks are the words of God. They are his words, since he is God in the flesh. His words will judge the one who rejects him. It is true that during his earthly ministry, Jesus did not judge, but do not be mistaken, he judges now.
So that's what he meant when he said, if anyone hears my words and doesn't keep them, I do not judge him. He meant, like, here and now, I don't judge you.
Yeah, but then
effectively, like, the words I do speak are what you will be judged by in eternity.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. Carrying on, Acts 10, verse 42, he commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one appointed by God to be the judge of the living and the dead. So we immediately see the reality of Christ's current condition. This passage plainly tells us what I was saying earlier, that Jesus is the one appointed by the Father to judge the living and the dead, the whole world. When we die, we will be judged. Our judgment will be according to whether or not we believed in him and his words. He will be the one who judges. So don't assume that Jesus is not judging now. He did not come into the world to judge, but he is certainly judging now. And then let us look at one more verse concerning the final judgment. And this is one more passage, I should say. Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 through 15. Then I saw a great white throne and one seated on it. Earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. I also saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works by what was written in the books. Then the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. Each one was judged according to their works. Death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. The great white throne is where Jesus sits. all the living and the dead will come before the great white throne for judgment. Several books will be opened. The first set of books are the records of the people who stand before the throne, so the records of all of the things that they did throughout their entire lives. The other book that's opened is the book of life. It is in this book that all the names of those who believed in Jesus will be written. Those whose names are not written in the book of life will be judged according to their works, which means all of the sins that they committed. And if I haven't said it before now, I want to define sin here. Sin is in layman's terms just breaking the moral law of God. That is the definition of sin. The frightening reality for all whose names are not written in the book of life is this: they will be judged justly for all of the sin that they committed in life. In accordance with this judgment, they will receive a just punishment, which is eternal separation from God. As a side note, I just want to say something. There are those out there right now who are claiming that hell is not terrible because of eternal separation from God, but because they are being punished by God's righteous anger for all eternity, and that he is somehow present in hell. I'm actually really disappointed in this concept, this idea. I do believe that it has caught traction, and again, I'm just sorely disappointed in that, because if you go to Second Thessalonians chapter 1 verse 9, it clearly states that this is the punishment that you will receive. They will pay the penalty of eternal destruction from the Lord's presence and from his glorious strength. They will be separated from his presence and his strength. Hell is not horrible because God is continually and actively punishing us. Hell is horrible because it removes us from everything that is good and holy and lovely about God. When we reject God in this life, our punishment is that we will never be reunited with him. We will never experience the glory of his presence, which is the absence of death and sorrow and grief and pain and suffering, or anything that would cause us to shed tears of agony. So imagine that being without him is the culmination of all of those things, whereas being with him is the absence of all of those things. To know God now is to know God forever. To reject God now is to reject God forever. Only God knows our hearts, and so only God can act as eternal judge and either justly deliver us from eternal separation or condemn us to eternal separation from him.
Man, that was I really like that, but that's like talking about eternal judgment. It's kind of a lot to take in,
It's interesting to me that judgment is a theme throughout Scripture.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to God's moral law.
Yeah, and I'm still amazed. Like, when I loved the comparison, the multiple books. There's the one book of all those whose names are not written in the book of life, and all of them, they have their record of debt that stands against them, and they are judged accordingly. And then you have the Lamb's book. It's just the names of all God's chosen people.
Yeah, and their slate is clean.
Their slate is clean. It's just, beautiful message of the forgiveness we have through the blood of Christ.
Yes.
So just to overview what I talked about today, our story is on the very unfortunate, tragic shooting where an Orange County Superior Court judge by the name of Jeffrey Ferguson shot and killed his wife Cheryl in their living room in a sort of drunken rage on August 3rd, 2023. He was booked into jail that night and then released the next day on $1 million bail. He's been formally charged with murder with 2 gun enhancements on the charge, amounting to more than 25 years to life, in addition to whatever sentence he may receive for murdering his wife. We also discussed how judges are generally appointed in our country, as well as the responsibilities that they have.
Yeah, and then a recap of what we talked about in regards to the biblical conclusions. A judge in the Bible is someone who is designated by God to judge righteously and without compromise the moral law of God. Old Testament judges were both those who judged between conflict and also protected against Israel's enemies. The judges of the Old Testament stopped with the age of the kings. Judging in the New Testament is a judgment unto reconciliation and not condemnation. Believers are to judge each other for correction and reconciliation with God. The church has no business judging non-believers, as they have not confessed a desire to be held to the moral law of God. And that is only something that God can do. And the last point was, the judge who sits upon the great white throne is Christ, who has been designated judge by God the Father. He will judge based both upon the names written in the book of life unto eternal reconciliation to God, and those names whose names are not written in the book of life in accordance with their sins and unto eternal separation from God.
All right, so that is going to wrap it up for this episode of the Bible Speaks podcast. As always, Brian and I are very thankful to all of you who listened to this episode. We do ask that you send your suggestions for news stories to us at thebiblespeakspodcast@gmail.com. And then also, if you could leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or drop a like on the YouTube or, anything like that, we'd really appreciate it. We also ask that you share the episodes, that you subscribe to the podcast. We would greatly appreciate it if you did so. We look forward to being back here with you all on the next episode. That's all for now. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.
See you next time.